Hello, America. Judge Andrew Napolitano here in for Glenn tonight. The budget battle is over. Or is it? Last Friday at the 11th hour, lawmakers reached an agreement over the rest of the 2011 fiscal year budget. They cut $38 billion in spending from what the president wanted. That's a bit more than 1% of the whole budget. It's downright embarrassing to see lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, well, excluding the few that demanded much bigger cuts, go to the mat over just peanuts. This budget negotiation was just another example of politicians acting like children. $38 billion is such a small number. Whether you believe in unconstitutional big government that can right any wrong or regulate any behavior, or constitutional abiding small government that should leave people alone, these cuts should mean nothing. The federal government, even after the cuts, will still need to borrow $1 trillion between now and this October. And yet, many on the left, like Princeton economics professor and New York Times columnist Paul Krugman, are furious at the president for allowing these cuts because, Professor Krugman says, many on the right are championing the cuts as a principled stand against big government. What nonsense. But there is a glimmer of hope. The final vote on the budget deal has not yet happened. Last Friday's agreement only funds the government through this Thursday. Congress still needs to vote on this budget deal. Here we go again. Joining me now is a major voice of the Tea Party, Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul. Senator Paul, welcome here. What's the feeling? Good to be with you. Thank you. What's the feeling amongst Tea Party members in Congress? Did the White House cave or did the Republican leadership cave?
Well, the amazing thing about it is for all the talk of cutting government and cutting government spending, we will spend more in 2011 than we spent in 2010. The deficit in 2011, this year, will be next year. So we were going to, and yet the deficit grows larger and spending larger.
All right, Senator Paul, we're having a little difficulty hearing you, and we hope to get through to you. Soon. What Senator Paul was arguing before we had our technical difficulties. I think he's back with us now. Senator Paul, are you back with us?
Yes, I am. What I was saying is basically this.
All right, we're having some difficulty with him, but the argument he was making is that the government will be spending more money this year than it did last year, even with the cuts. All right, the next big budget battle facing Capitol Hill is over the need to raise the $14.3 trillion debt limit. And Republicans like House Speaker John Boehner are saying no way to an increase. Over the weekend at a fundraiser, Speaker Boehner said this: the president says, I want you to send me a clean bill. Well, guess what, Mr. President? Not a chance you're going to get a clean bill. And I can tell you this, there will not be an increase in the debt limit without something really, really big attached to us. Joining me now, Republican Congressman Connie Mack of Florida. Congressman Mack, it's a pleasure. Welcome to the Glenn Beck program.
Thank you, Judge. It's good to be with you, and you look good at this time of the day.
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you. We were just talking to Senator Rand Paul, your Republican colleague, before we had some technical difficulties, and we hope to bring him back, about who caved in this deal. Charlie Rangel's seated next to me, and he has his own views, and we'll get to them in a few minutes. But in Congressman Connie Mack's view, who caved? The Republican leadership in the Congress or the White House?
Well, you know, I don't want to start saying who caved. But what I would like to point out is that the little amount of cuts that we got in spending, you would have thought, the left, you would have thought that we were defunding all of government. I mean, we're talking such a small percentage, a small number in actual cuts. I mean, I think this last deal is going to be about $26 billion out of almost a $3.5 trillion budget. Right. I mean, it's amazing that we can't even come together to make real cuts because we are broke.
Well, here's the point that Senator Paul was making, and I will make with Congressman Rangel, and I'll put it to you. After all of this haggling and going down almost literally to the last minute on Friday night, the president, Speaker Boehner, Majority Leader Reid agreed to a budget for the rest of this fiscal year, which is just the next 6 months, that spends $38 billion less than what the president wanted to spend. it still authorizes the president to borrow $1 trillion. So by October, you know this, Congressman Mack, the $14.3 trillion debt will be $15.3 trillion debt. That cannot be considered progress for those of us like you and me and many people watching now who believe that just like your household and mine, the government should live within its limits. It shouldn't spend more than it takes in. So how can this be a victory for anybody except the big government people who think we can just keep piling debt onto debt onto debt?
Well, I agree with you, Judge. I don't look at this as a victory. The sad thing here is as we negotiate and battle back and forth in Washington, it's people back home who are hurting. And they're the ones that recognize that we cannot continue to sustain this spending. And I think they're quite offended that the amount of cuts we got is so little compared to the overall budget that we spend here in Washington, D.C. Frankly, a lot of that money is spent on things that most people back home don't know about and don't care about.
If members of Congress vote for this deal, doesn't that mean that they are not concerned about this bottomless pit of debt? They are willing to make the bottomless pit deeper. They just don't take the issue of debt seriously.
Well, I'll let all the other members speak for themselves. But for me, I take this seriously, Judge. We cannot continue to spend like we are. It's why I voted no on the CR on Friday, and it's why I'm going to vote no coming up later this week on the CR, because this is a drop in the bucket. And if we're going to be serious about cutting the debt, cutting the deficit, balancing the budget, something like $26 billion, which is what the new cut is going to be come Friday, is nothing. And it should be appalling to a lot of people that we couldn't find a way to cut more money out of the budget.
All right. In about 2 or 3 weeks, the government will reach its borrowing limit. It'll reach literally that 14.3. It's about actually 14.294 trillion. And then the president will come to the Congress and say, give us authority to borrow more. This is, as you know, called raising the debt ceiling, letting the government dig that $14.3 trillion hole even deeper. How will Congressman Connie Mack vote on that? Yes, Mr. President, go borrow another $1.6 trillion. No, Mr. President, you can't borrow any more money. Operate the government on the money that the IRS collects for you.
As I've told you before, Judge, and I'll say it over and over again, why have a debt ceiling if all you're going to do when you approach it is raise it? The reason we have a debt ceiling in the first place is so a long time ago we could have started looking at ways to cut spending so we wouldn't have to even have a conversation about raising it. Unfortunately, the Congress is now in a position, we're going to hear it from both sides, that we don't have enough time to do anything else, that we have to raise the debt limit ceiling. I'm going to vote no on raising the debt limit ceiling. I don't think it's the right thing for it to do. And I think the people back home, again, Judge, the people back home are saying, look, I have to live within our means at home, and the federal government has to live within its means. And by the way, its means is the people's money, not ours.
Right. Congressman Connie Mack of Florida, thanks very much for joining us. Senator Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, rejoins us on the telephone. Sorry about the technical difficulties, Senator Paul, but we're happy, and those watching us now are happy that you're here. You were explaining to us, I think, when we had these technical difficulties, that notwithstanding the $38 billion in cuts that the White House says are too big, that the Republican leadership says are not big enough, that the Tea Party persons in the Congress say are not nearly big enough, the government will actually spend more in 2011 than it did in 2010.
Yeah, this is what's amazing to me. For all the discussion with people saying, oh, we're going to cut spending, it's great that we're going to cut spending, we will spend more this year than we did last year. The deficit will also be more this year than it was last year. The interesting thing is, during the 8 days that we debated this last spending bill, we borrowed over $50 billion in those 8 days, and then they were talking about cuts of $38 billion. So we're borrowing more in 1 week than they talked about cutting. Really, they haven't yet become serious about this, and until we become serious about this, I worry about trillion-dollar annual deficit.
Right. Senator Paul, how did we get here? How did we get to this position in American history where the government borrows as much as it takes in tax revenue and seems to think that the borrowing can go on without end and without being paid back?
It's been going on for a couple of generations now, but it's accelerated. I was one of those who ran for office saying Republicans were spending way too much money during the last administration. we had $500 billion deficit. But then in 2008, when we got President Obama, it went up exponentially. So we now have $1.5 trillion deficits in 1 year. But most of the plans are arguing for gradual reduction in spending over 10 and 20 years, when in fact the increase in spending went up in a 2-year period.
Wow. When you have to vote in the next couple of weeks on raising the debt ceiling, I assume you'll be in the same column as your colleague Congressman Connie Mack, who was just on with us a few minutes ago, and you'll vote no.
Yeah, I can't vote to raise the debt ceiling unless it was the last time we're ever going to do it, and that would be that we were going to balance our budget from here on out. So if we pass the balanced budget amendment and introduce my 5-year plan to balance the budget, I could consider voting to raise the debt ceiling. But we're not there yet. We're just the will of the people is ready for us to do these things, but those in Washington, those who have been elected, are not yet hearing the voice of the people.
Senator Paul, we appreciate it. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Thanks for getting on the phone with us.
No problem.
Congress has until Thursday evening at 11:59 p.m., a minute before midnight, to come up with yet another budget agreement. And my next guest says compromise has been a filthy, ugly word for freshman Republican members. Democratic Congressman Charlie Rangel of the great state of New York and from Harlem, New York is here. Congressman Rangel, welcome here.
Good to be in your courthouse.
All right. Were you happy with this deal that the Republican leadership of the House and the Democratic leadership of the Senate and the President cut for this $38 billion reduction?
Not at all, but I am glad that both sides realized the negative impact it would be if we had to close down our government. I think that everyone made it abundantly clear that more than saving $38 billion, we would have lost a heck of a lot more money.
All right.
But I just wish you could ask me that one question that you asked the Congressman Mack, and that is, how did we get involved in all of this? When did it happen?
This is not a Republican or a Democratic problem. This has happened under Republican presidents and Republican Congresses and Democratic presidents and Democratic Congresses.
I wouldn't put it that way, Judge. Of course, I'm in your court.
How is it that we got to $14 trillion in debt and that nobody's concerned but the Tea Party people about paying it back?
Because if you remember, the last Democratic president that we've had, that is before Bush and Reagan, was Bill Clinton.
Right.
He left a $5.6 trillion surplus. Now, the $14 trillion didn't happen overnight.
No, I know
but several things happened.
Well, we fought a couple of wars. We had 9/11.
Don't say
it
that way, because
I'm not justifying what George Bush did. I'm asking you.
Well, you said, how did we get there?
You're a longtime member of Congress.
Yes.
You always vote in favor of more borrowing.
Don't say
that. It's true. How are we going to pay the money back?
First of all this business about not voting for the debt ceiling is ridiculous. Why? Because the $14.2 or $3 trillion that we owe happened before we owed it, and we still now owe the interest on what has been borrowed, whether it's Republican or Democrat.
We are paying interest on money that was spent by prior Congresses and presidents.
And if we don't pay the interest on it, if we don't raise the debt ceiling, the whole darn fiscal system collapses.
All right, you reject the Senator Pat Toomey argument that we can pay the interest from the income tax revenue. You think we have to borrow more money in order to pay interest on money that we've already borrowed and spent, right?
Let me take it, no. But let me take it a step in assuming that you're right, because this whole thing is so inequitable and so truly unfair. When last have they talked about raising revenue in order to balance the budget? They just don't talk about it.
When last have the Democrats, and even many of the Republicans, I'm not a partisan here, you know that, talked about stopping the spending or slowing the spending in order to balance the budget?
If you weren't a judge, I would say you changed the issue. Because the last question I thought you asked was, can we raise enough revenue without increasing the debt ceiling?
You understand?
And I say that this administration says that they're going to stop the spending and not have any taxes at all.
But this administration, the President Obama's administration, wants to borrow $1 trillion in 6 months. And then they want to borrow $1.7 trillion in the next 12 months. So they want to add $2.7 trillion to the debt without paying a nickel of it back. Are you in favor of that?
Judge, if you don't pay the interest on the debt.
No one's saying not pay the interest.
Well, how you got to pay it if you don't have the money?
I'm suggesting we shouldn't be borrowing more money. We should spend less and pay off the debt. You don't want to do that.
Where are you going to get the money from if you don't borrow it? You tell me.
Well, let's see.
We're not going to raise taxes. We're not going to stop these wars.
We should stop the wars. On that, we both agree.
Well, I hope so.
We should stop all 5 of the wars. But we do collect about $250 billion in taxes every month. Unfortunately, we also borrow $200 billion.
We have corporations that don't play zip. We have the trillionaires that don't pay
That would be General Electric, the chairman of which is the president's good friend and sits on his advisory board.
And he's not the only one that don't pay.
Look, nobody should pay more taxes than they owe. We know that.
Republicans are saying that you don't raise taxes and you just cut spending.
And the Democrats are saying just keep borrowing ourselves into oblivion.
That's just not so. But I tell you one thing, if we do have to cut, the immoral way in which they're cutting, the poor, the sick, the aged, is not the American way to do it.
Can I tell you, even when I disagree with you, I enjoy when you come on any show with me. Charlie Rangel, thanks for joining us. Congress may have reached a budget deal, but the mother of all budget battles is yet to come. Should we raise the federal debt limit? You know where I stand on that. But a fair and balanced debate is next. To you, Charlie Rangel.